The submarine is flooding rapidly and the captain is steering toward the shore. Running on the surface in waters roughly 70 meters deep off Vladivostok, K-56's forward compartments are suddenly torn open, flooding faster than the gauges can register. In the control room, Captain Nikolai Leonov feels the bow tipping forward, hears the steel bulkheads groaning under pressure that shouldn't exist. Not here, not in friendly waters, not during what should have been a routine patrol. Nearly 100 survivors are trapped in the aft sections, breathing recycled air, waiting for orders that follow no manual, no protocol, no precedent in Soviet naval history. The charts on his table show nothing but open water in depth. The coastline is a death sentence for any submarine. But Leonov is calculating angles anyway. Speed, ballast, the narrowing minutes before physics makes the choice for him. His executive officer is asking what heading to set. The answer will either be taught at every naval academy in the world, or it will stay buried with everyone aboard. Leonov's hand moves to the helm controls. The shoreline is only a few kilometers away. He has no idea if the hull will hold. Earlier that night, K-56 had been conducting operations in the waters off Vladivostok. Historical accounts suggest the submarine had completed a series of missile tests and was making its return transit on the surface. Conditions were calm, visibility was good, and the crew expected to reach their base at Pavlovsk Bay by 0500 hours. Captain Suvorov had commanded numerous such operations. The crew was experienced, the submarine was mechanically sound, and these waters were well-charted territory for the Pacific Fleet. Nothing about the night suggested the vessel would be fighting for survival in less than 30 minutes. K-56 was an Echo 2 class guided missile submarine, designated Project 675 by Soviet designers. The vessel measured approximately 115 meters from bow to stern and displaced nearly 6,000 tons when submerged. 8 cylindrical tubes mounted in pairs along the deck housed P-6 cruise missiles designed to surface launch at NATO carrier groups from ranges exceeding 300 kilometers. The submarine's hull was a double-layer steel pressure vessel capable of diving to 300 meters. Twin pressurized water nuclear reactors drove twin screws at speeds up to 23 knots submerged. The standard crew numbered 90, but on this patrol, K-56 carried over 30 guests, including senior naval observers and civilian technicians invited to witness the missile test from the control room. That extra load would matter in the minutes ahead. Around midnight, the crew first noted surface contacts on their radar while transiting the Gulf. Fishing boats and civilian research vessels were common in these waters. The Soviet Pacific Fleet shared the sea with a busy coastal shipping corridor. While returning to port after completing missile exercises, the K-56 was transiting on the surface. The sonar team identified one contact as the Academician Berg, a research vessel home-ported at Vladivostok. Range was closing, but the contact's course appeared to pass clear of the submarine's track. Shortly before the collision, the radar was secured for maintenance, leaving lookouts as the primary means of detection. The crew had only moments to react after lookouts finally spotted the vessel's lights through the darkness. The Academician Berg's bow struck K-56 amidships on the port side, punching through the outer hull and rupturing the pressure hull forward of the control room. Compartments 1 and 2, torpedo storage and crew berthing, opened to the sea in an instant. Seawater flooded in at pressures exceeding 7 atmospheres, filling the compartments faster than men could react. The collision killed 27 sailors in the first seconds, either from the impact itself or from drowning as the compartments filled. Watertight doors between compartments 2 and 3 slammed shut automatically, but the collision had bent the door frames. Rubber gaskets could not seat properly. Water began spraying through the gaps into compartment 3, where the damage control team was already scrambling forward with emergency patching gear. The damage control team reached the watertight door between compartments 2 and 3 within 20 seconds of impact. Standard procedure called for manual dogging of the door wheel to reinforce the automatic seal. But when the chief petty officer spun the wheel, he felt the frame flex under his hands. The collision had buckled the steel door frame by several centimeters. The rubber gasket could not bridge the gap. Water sprayed through the top edge of the door at high velocity, filling the passageway ankle-deep in seconds. The team tried stuffing canvas and wooden wedges into the gap, but the pressure was too high. Seawater was entering Compartment 3 faster than the bilge pumps could remove it. In the control room, the captain ordered emergency blow of the forward ballast tanks to lift the bow and slow the flooding. The diving officer pulled the red-handled lever, releasing compressed air at 200 atmospheres into the ballast tanks. Normally, that air would displace seawater and force the bow upward toward the surface. But the collision had ruptured the ballast tank piping along with the pressure hole. The compressed air vented uselessly into the flooded compartments and out through the hull breach. No buoyancy returned. The depth gauge needles continued to swing downward. The submarine's bow stayed heavy, tilting the deck forward at an angle that grew steeper every second. The water in Compartment 3 climbed from ankle-deep to knee-deep in less than a minute. The bulkhead separating Compartments 3 and 4 was rated to withstand pressure differentials up to 10 atmospheres, but only when the door was properly sealed. With water pouring through the compromised door from Compartment 2 and flooding Compartment 3, the pressure began building against the next bulkhead aft. The ingress of water through the damaged hatch far exceeded the capacity of the compartment's drainage systems, overwhelming the pumps designed to handle routine leaks. Progressive flooding had begun, each compartment filling faster than the crew could seal or pump, spreading the damage aft through the submarine, one bulkhead at a time. Captain Suvorov checked the navigation chart on the control room table. The collision site was marked in waters roughly 200 meters deep, well within the operating envelope for an Echo 2 class submarine under normal conditions, but far too deep for any emergency. If K-56 sank to the bottom here, the hull would implode under pressure long before rescue vessels could arrive from Vladivostok. The Soviet Navy's deep-sea rescue capability in 1973 was limited to depths under 150 meters, and even that required hours to deploy. According to the Accident Investigation Board, no submarine rescue system in the world could have reached the crew in time at this location. Surfacing the submarine in a controlled manner required neutral buoyancy and a working ballast system. K-56 had neither. The flooded forward compartments had added hundreds of tons of weight to the bow, creating a nose-down angle that was increasing every second. The diving planes, horizontal control surfaces on the bow and stern, could counteract a few degrees of pitch under normal power, but they had no authority against the mass of water flooding forward. If Suvorov tried to surface now, the submarine would tip stern up, flood the remaining compartments through open vents and hatches, and sink bow first within minutes. The control room crew understood the physics. Staying submerged meant slow death by flooding. Attempting to surface meant fast death by inversion and implosion. Captain Suvorov pulled the navigation chart closer and scanned the coastline northeast of the collision site. The chart showed deep water missile test ranges, marked hazards for surface shipping, and depth contours for safe submarine operations. It showed nothing about the shallow coastal waters beyond the 5-kilometer line. No bathymetry data, no reef locations, no slope angles. Those shallows were the domain of fishing boats and local traffic, not nuclear submarines. The chart was useless for what Suvorov was considering. He would be navigating blind, gambling that somewhere between the collision site and the beach lay a patch of sand or mud flat shallow enough to ground the hull, but soft enough not to rupture the remaining intact compartments. Suvorov made the call. He ordered the helmsman to steer toward the coast and rang up flank speed on the engine order telegraph. The submarine would run submerged at maximum power, roughly 16 knots, straight toward the shallows where local fishing boats operated. If they found sand or mud before the hull lost buoyancy, the submarine would ground and the crew could evacuate. If they hit submerged rock or missed the shallows entirely, the impact would rupture the remaining compartments and the submarine would sink with all hands. There was no third option. The helmsman acknowledged the order and turned the wheel. The deck vibrated as the reactor plant spooled up to full power. According to available records, the engineering officer, Leonid Pshenichny, faced an impossible choice. The submarine was on the surface when it collided, but now the flooded bow was pulling them down as the captain ordered flank speed. Running at maximum power with the bow submerging would push the submarine's pitch angle past safe limits, The reactor cooling system, which relied on high-pressure pumps to maintain circulation, was sensitive to extreme angles that could disrupt the flow through its network of pipes and heat exchangers. Soviet reactor plants of this era had automatic safety triggers. If the bow-down angle exceeded approximately 15 degrees, the system would scram the reactor, dropping all control rods and shutting down the fission reaction to prevent core damage. Without the reactor, the submarine would lose propulsion and drift powerless in deep water. Historical accounts suggest that rather than objecting to the plan, Pshenichny heroically remained at his post, manually overriding the safety systems to keep the reactor running. Captain Lenislav Suchkov understood the stakes. Slowing down meant sinking. They had one chance, and it required full power. Captain Suvorov overrode the objection. If the reactor scrammed mid-sprint, the submarine would lose propulsion and sink in deep water. The same outcome as doing nothing, but slower. If they hit submerged rock instead of sand at 16 knots, the hull would rupture and everyone would die. Again, the same outcome, but faster. The only path that offered any chance of survival was the one that accepted both risks and bet everything on reaching a sandbar before the bow angle hit 15 degrees or the hull lost reserve buoyancy. Suvorov ordered all non-essential crew aft to shift weight away from the bow and told the engineering officer to keep the reactor online as long as physically possible. The sprint had begun. There was no turning back. The helmsman pushed the throttle control forward to the flank speed detent. The twin screws bit into the water, and K-56 surged ahead at 16 knots, bow down and flooding in complete darkness. Sonar had no active mode that could map the bottom ahead without revealing the submarine's position to surface vessels, so the sonar operator relied on passive listening, tracking the noise of fishing boat engines and trying to infer water depth from the acoustic returns. The navigator plotted a dead reckoning course on the chart. According to some dramatic accounts of the grounding run, the time to the shallows was estimated at roughly 3 minutes if the submarine maintained speed and if the flooding did not pitch the bow past the reactor scram angle first. No one in the control room spoke. The deck tilted forward as the bow took on water, the angle growing steeper with each passing moment. Seawater flooding compartments 1 and 2 added roughly 300 tons of weight to the bow, far forward of the submarine's center of gravity. That weight created a nose-heavy moment, a rotational force, that pitched the vessel downward. Each additional ton of water shifted the center of gravity further forward and increased the angle. The submarine's trim system, designed to adjust buoyancy by pumping water between ballast tanks, could normally counteract a few tons of imbalance. But 300 tons was beyond any trim system's capacity. The bow was sinking under its own weight, and the only force resisting that rotation was the hydrodynamic lift from the diving planes and the forward speed of the hull through the water. Slow down, and the bow would drop faster. Speed was the only thing keeping the submarine from tipping vertical. The submarine's pressurized water reactor relied on gravity-assisted coolant circulation. Hot water from the reactor core flowed upward into a heat exchanger, where it transferred energy to a secondary loop that drove the steam turbines. Cooled water then flowed downward back to the core through pipes angled to use gravity as a secondary driver if the main pumps lost power. The system was designed for a maximum pitch angle of 15 degrees in any direction. Beyond that angle, the coolant outlet pipes would trap air bubbles, causing cavitation in the pump impellers and reducing flow to the reactor core. To prevent core damage, the automatic safety system would scram the reactor the moment sensors detected coolant flow below safe thresholds. Once scrammed, the reactor could not be restarted without surfacing in hours of procedure. For K-56, a scram meant the end of propulsion and the end of any chance to reach shore. Water was spreading aft through the compromised bulkhead into Compartment 3. Every flooded compartment swallowed roughly 400 cubic meters of reserve buoyancy, air replaced by seawater ton by ton. An Echo II class submarine typically maintained a reserve buoyancy in the range of 1,300 to 1,500 cubic meters when all ballast tanks were blown. With compartments 1 and 2 already flooded, 800 cubic meters were gone. As Compartment 3 filled, the numbers told a brutal story. The submarine wasn't just tilting, it was becoming heavier. Sinking deeper despite the diving planes fighting to hold depth. And the deeper the hull sank, the greater the pressure crushing against the remaining bulkheads, accelerating the flood rate, shortening the time to total loss of buoyancy. Only so much steel stood between the crew and the Pacific, and it was never designed to hold this much weight. The helmsman gripped the diving plane control yoke, pulling back to force the bow upward. The diving planes were horizontal control surfaces mounted on the bow and stern, each roughly 3 meters wide, that deflected water flow to generate lift or downforce. At 16 knots, the planes could produce enough lift to counteract several degrees of pitch under normal conditions. But the 300-ton flood weight in the bow created a moment far beyond the plane's authority. The helmsman was fighting a losing battle. According to accounts from the crew, the bow-down angle increased rapidly in the opening moments of the sprint, climbing several degrees as the submarine accelerated. The diving planes slowed the rate of increase, but could not stop it. Every second the submarine ran at flank speed, more water flooded aft, adding weight and steepening the angle. The race was on. Reach the sandbar before the angle hit 15 degrees. In the reactor compartment, the engineering officer watched the pitch angle indicator and ran the numbers in his head. Based on his calculations, the bow-down angle appeared to be increasing at roughly 1 degree every 15 seconds. The submarine was at 10 degrees. The reactor Scram threshold was 15 degrees. That left 5 degrees of margin, or roughly 75 seconds before automatic shutdown. But the flood rate was accelerating as water spread into Compartment 3, so the angle was climbing faster now. The engineering officer estimated they had 90 seconds at most before the reactor scrammed. After that, the submarine would coast on momentum for perhaps another 30 seconds before losing steerage and sinking bow first into 150 meters of water. The sandbar had to be closer than 2 minutes away, or the sprint was already over. The crew monitored the depth beneath the keel as the submarine raced toward shore. Historical accounts suggest the bottom was rising rapidly. The shallows were ahead, but the submarine was also sinking deeper as buoyancy failed. The vertical distance between the keel and the seabed was closing from both directions, the bottom rising toward the submarine and the submarine sinking toward the bottom. If the two met in deep water before the submarine reached the sandbar, the hull would strike rock or hard bottom at 16 knots, rupturing compartments and killing everyone aboard. If the submarine reached the shallows first, there was a chance the bottom would be soft, sand, or mud that could arrest the hull without destroying it. The window was narrowing to seconds. The angle indicator needle showed the submarine taking on a steep bow-down trim. In the reactor compartment, the engineering officer shouted the warning over the intercom. 30 seconds to automatic scram. The coolant flow sensors were already registering reduced circulation as air bubbles formed in the outlet pipes. The reactor protection system was designed to err on the side of safety, which meant it would scram early if it detected any hint of cavitation. 30 seconds was an optimistic estimate. The engineering officer watched the flow meters and the angle gauge simultaneously, waiting for the numbers to cross the threshold that would shut down the reactor and end any chance of reaching shore. His hand hovered over the manual scram button, ready to shut the reactor down himself if it looked like automatic scram was imminent. At least that way, he could control the timing. The commander ordered all senior observers and non-essential personnel to move aft immediately. Every kilogram of weight shifted away from the bow bought a fraction of a degree of margin on the pitch angle. According to accounts of the disaster, available personnel squeezed through the narrow passageways toward the stern compartments, adding their combined body weight to the aft section. It was not enough to reverse the flooding, but in theory it might help maintain the submarine's trim for precious additional moments. In a crisis measured in seconds, even small advantages could mean the difference between grounding on sand and sinking in deep water. The observers moved quickly, understanding without explanation that their lives depended on physics and geometry as much as on the captain's judgment. The crew monitored the rapidly shoaling water as they approached the shore. The bottom was rushing up toward the submarine, but K-56 was still making 16 knots, blind, with no way to know whether the seabed ahead was sand, mud, or submerged granite ledge. The navigator tried to estimate the slope angle from the rate of depth change, hoping to infer the bottom composition, but there was no reliable way to tell. Fishing boats operated in these waters, which suggested sand or mud rather than rock, but that was a guess based on peacetime coastal traffic patterns, not hard bathymetric data. The entire sprint was a bet on probabilities. Within moments, the crew would find out whether the captain had guessed right. The bow slammed into the bottom with a grinding roar that echoed through the entire hull. Steel flexed and groaned. Men were thrown forward against bulkheads and consoles. The submarine shuddered as the forward momentum drove the bow deep into the seabed, and then, abruptly, the vessel stopped. The stern rose upward as the bow buried itself in sand, pitching the deck backward at a steep angle. The reactor stayed online. The engineering officer checked the angle gauge, 14.8 degrees, 0.2 of a degree below the automatic Scram threshold. The coolant flow stabilized. The propulsion plant was still running, but it no longer mattered. K-56 was grounded in 12 meters of water, bow buried, stern elevated above the surface. The sprint was over. With the bow grounded and the stern elevated above the surface, the surviving crew evacuated through the aft hatches onto the sail and into rescue boats. The grounding had stopped the progressive flooding. Water was no longer spreading aft because the submarine was no longer sinking. The stern compartments remained dry and pressurized, allowing crew to move freely to the upper hatches. Vladivostok Naval Base dispatched patrol boats, with some records suggesting initial vessels were prepared within 20 minutes of receiving the emergency transmission. Over the next 2 hours, 107 men climbed out of K-56 onto rescue vessels. The evacuation was orderly and complete. No one panicked. No one was left behind. The captain was the last man off the submarine. 27 men died in the collision and immediate flooding of compartments 1 and 2. All casualties occurred in the first seconds of the disaster, either from the impact itself or from drowning as seawater flooded the breached compartments. No additional casualties occurred during the sprint to shore, the grounding, or the evacuation. The damage control teams who attempted to seal the watertight doors between compartments 2 and 3 survived because they were working aft of the breach when the collision happened. The senior naval observers aboard for the missile test all survived. The grounding saved every man who was still alive when Captain Suvorov made the decision to run for shore. But there was one more group still aboard: senior naval observers. These weren't ordinary crew. They were officers carrying detailed knowledge of Soviet cruise missile technology, fire control procedures, and Pacific Fleet operational protocols. If K-56 had sunk in deep water, they would have either drowned or been forced to surface near civilian vessels, creating the risk of intelligence compromise or capture. The grounding changed everything. All classified personnel were recovered by Soviet rescue forces without exposure to foreign observation. Historical analysts suggest that the secure recovery of these senior officers likely served as a significant mitigating factor in the captain's subsequent exoneration, preventing the loss of both sensitive technology and experienced personnel. More men who made it home. The Soviet Navy's accident investigation classified the incident as a navigation failure with serious consequences. The collision with the Akademischen Berg occurred in a known shipping corridor during a period when multiple civilian vessels were transiting the area. The investigation reportedly focused on inadequate radar watch and visual observation in foggy conditions, finding that the crew should have maintained more vigilant surface surveillance and altered course sooner to avoid the research vessel. However, internal damage control reviews within the Pacific Fleet are believed to have credited the captain's decision to ground the submarine as a compelling example of emergency seamanship under impossible constraints. The sprint to shore became a case study in Soviet submarine command schools, illustrating that doctrine sometimes requires abandoning doctrine when physics and time leave no other option. Historical accounts differ on how long K-56 remained on the sandbar, though authoritative sources indicate the submarine was refloated and towed to port within a day of the grounding. Post-incident analysis by naval historians suggests that early Soviet designs, including the Echo II class, faced significant structural integrity challenges during catastrophic failures. Technical post-mortems of similar incidents indicate that bulkhead frame distortion could compromise watertight sealing mechanisms, though the specific failure modes aboard K-56 remain incompletely documented. Captain Suvorov's actions are often cited as a masterclass in emergency seamanship. In extreme emergencies, Soviet submarine captains were expected to take all necessary measures to save their crews, which could include unconventional maneuvers like intentional grounding. Whether Suvorov's desperate gamble influenced formal Pacific Fleet doctrine remains unclear, but his decision is celebrated as a rare example of successful crisis management under impossible circumstances.